The ranchers stand in the dusty heartland where the prairie met the foothills of the jagged Crimson Mountains. There lived a quiet man named Eli Granger. He wasn't the kind to draw attention to himself. He didn't drink in the saloon, didn't gossip on the chapel steps, and didn't care for politics or profit. What he cared about were his horses, the creak of the windmill, and the land that had been in his family for 3 generations. His ranch, though modest, was well kept, with fences that stood straight and strong, and animals that were treated with the kind of quiet dignity only a man like Eli could offer. Eli's reputation in the village of Pine Hollow was that of a loner, a man who had seen too much war and sorrow to be drawn into small-town drama. He had once fought in the Northern Uprising nearly 2 decades ago, and though he rarely spoke of it, the scars on his forearms and the heaviness in his eyes told stories no words ever could. Folks respected him from a distance, but few truly knew him. It was during a cool spring evening that Eli's life and the town's judgment of him would change forever. The sun had dipped below the hills, painting the sky in streaks of lavender and gold, when Eli heard a faint rustling near his stables. He was returning from the fields with a sack of grain slung over his shoulder when he paused, narrowing his eyes toward the barn. The horses were restless, whinnying in low, uncertain tones. He moved carefully, setting the sack down and stepping into the shadows. He expected a coyote or maybe a thief after his supplies. What he found was something else entirely. A young girl, no older than 16, was huddled inside a pile of hay near the back of the barn. Her cloak was torn, her face smeared with dirt and tears, and her bare feet were bruised from travel. She looked up at Eli with eyes wide as moons, terrified and unsure whether he would help her or send her away. Eli didn't say a word at first. He simply handed her a flask of water and gestured for her to sit on the bench near the stall door. After a few hesitant moments, she obeyed, her small hands trembling as she drank. "Name's Eli," he said softly, not wanting to scare her further. "You're safe now. But you look like you've been running." The girl nodded slowly. "My name is Seraphine," she whispered. "They're looking for me." Eli could have asked a dozen questions right then. Who was looking for her? What had she done? Was there a danger to him for taking her in? But something in her voice, raw, frightened, desperate, told him all he needed to know. She wasn't a criminal. She was a child in trouble. He didn't press her. Instead, he led her into the kitchen of his cabin, gave her a bowl of stew, and lit the old oil lamp on the wooden table. The light flickered gently across her face as she ate in silence. Eventually, she fell asleep on the cot near the fireplace, too exhausted to speak anymore. Eli sat by the window most of the night, rifle across his lap, eyes scanning the horizon. He didn't know what kind of storm he'd brought into his life, but he knew he couldn't turn her away. By morning, the village would know, and sure enough, they did. By the time the rooster crowed, a rider from the noble Caravana group passing through the territory had arrived in town, shouting accusations of a runaway. They claimed she was a ward of the high-born Aldric family, a servant girl who had fled under mysterious circumstances. Posters were printed, threats were made, and when someone mentioned seeing a girl near the Granger ranch, all heads turned. But Eli didn't flinch. He stood in his doorway, arms crossed, and met their questions with quiet defiance. "She's not going anywhere," he said. The townsfolk muttered, called him foolish, reckless. Some accused him of defying the nobles for attention. Others whispered darker things. But Eli didn't care. He had looked into that girl's eyes and seen truth, fear, yes, but also innocence. He hadn't asked for a fight. But sometimes, doing the right thing doesn't wait for convenience. And so, with the entire village watching, and the nobleman brewing anger like a storm on the horizon, Eli made a choice, to protect a stranger, to stand alone, and to let the world think what it would. The village turn's word traveled faster than wildfire in Pine Hollow. By sunrise, everyone from the blacksmith to the preacher had heard the tale. Old Eli Granger was hiding a runaway girl from a nobleman's caravan. At first, some thought it was just more small-town gossip. Eli, the quiet rancher who barely spoke more than a sentence at the general store. It seemed unlikely, but as soon as the royal riders returned to town, demanding the girls returned and accusing Eli directly, uncertainty turned to judgment. The townspeople gathered at the marketplace that morning, murmuring in small, agitated circles. The nobleman, steward, a sharp-nosed man with silk gloves and a voice like a whip reed, a statement aloud, declaring that the girl, Seraphine, was a ward under the protection of Lord Aldric, and that harboring her would be considered an act of rebellion against the kingdom. The words were clear. Any man who interferes with noble law shall be punished as if he defied the crown itself. That's when fear crept in. The townspeople weren't cruel, not exactly, but they were practical. They had shops to run, families to feed, taxes to pay. Most of them had lived quiet lives on the edge of nobility's rule, doing their best to avoid trouble. So when asked to choose between the law of the land and the actions of a solitary rancher, they leaned towards self-preservation. One by one, neighbors who had once tipped their hats to Eli began to back away. Clara, the baker, refused to sell him flour that morning. Nothing personal, Mr. Granger, she muttered, not meeting his eyes. I just don't want to be involved. Samuel, the tool merchant, looked away when Eli passed, pretending not to see him at all. By noon, the whispers had turned into open mockery. He's lost his mind, said a farmer near the well. Harboring a runaway girl like she's some kind of princess. Probably just wants the attention. Another spat. Always did think he was better than the rest of us. Even children were pulled aside by their parents when they saw Eli walk into town, their laughter replaced by wary glances. The man who had once helped fix neighbors' fences without asking for a coin now walked among them like a stranger. And yet, Eli said nothing. He didn't argue, didn't try to defend himself. He simply returned to his ranch, where Seraphine still slept by the hearth. When she stirred and asked what had happened, he only said, "Folks are scared. They'll come around, or they won't." But deep down it stung. The betrayal of silence, the loneliness of doing right while everyone else turned to wait, was a quiet kind of pain, one Eli knew all too well. It reminded him of the war, when the people who shouted the loudest often knew the least about sacrifice. The mayor, a man named Barrow, who always prided himself on avoiding conflict, came to Eli's gate later that day. He didn't come with soldiers, just a folded paper and a forced smile. "I have been asked to mediate," Barrow began, fiddling nervously with his pocket watch. "The Noble family insists the girl is their property by arrangement. They've offered to forgive the matter if you return her quietly and without resistance." Eli crossed his arms, unmoved. "She's not a thing to be returned." Barrow hesitated. "Look, Eli, I know you mean well, but you're putting this whole town in a difficult spot. If the nobles report this to the crown, we could all face consequences. Trade routes could be cut, supplies held back. You know how these things go." Eli stared at him for a long moment before replying. "Then maybe it's time someone said no." The mayor left, looking older than he had when he arrived. That evening, as the sky grew dim and the village lights glowed like fireflies in the distance, Eli stood on his porch and watched the road. There was no cavalry yet, no mob with torches, but the weight of isolation was real. He'd drawn a line in the sand, and for now, he stood on one side alone. Inside, Seraphine brought him a bowl of stew. "They all hate you now," she whispered. Eli looked at her with a tired smile. "No, they just don't know better yet." And in that moment, as the stars blinked quietly above the fields, a sense of calm settled over him, not because he believed the danger had passed, but because he knew, without a doubt, that he'd chosen the right side of the line, even if no one else saw eye. Eli's unwavering belief as the days passed. The tension in Pine Hollow grew thick enough to cut with a knife. The noble envoy remained stationed in a large encampment just outside the town, their crimson flags fluttering in the dry wind like warning signs. Soldiers came and went on horseback, watching Eli's ranch from a distance. The townspeople grew increasingly nervous, avoiding his land altogether as if it were cursed. And yet, Eli didn't budge. Every morning, he rose before the sun, just as he always had. He fed the horses, tended to the cattle, and worked the fields in silence. There was a heaviness to his movements now, but not weakness. It was the weight of conviction, of knowing that doing the right thing often came at a cost. People came knocking out of curiosity, others to try and talk sense into him. They spoke in low voices, urging him to hand the girl over before things escalated. Eli listened politely each time, but his answer never changed. "I won't send a child back to men who'd use her like livestock." When asked if he was willing to risk Jailor Wersh's answer remained simple. "I've faced worse for less." It wasn't bravado, it was truth. Eli had fought in the Northern Uprising, a brutal campaign that had torn through the frontier years ago. He had seen men betray their friends for gold, and watched others stand firm in the face of certain death. He knew that real strength didn't come from fists or weapons, it came from standing for something when no one else would dot at night. Eli kept watch from the porch of his cabin, rifle resting across his lap. The lantern beside him flickered softly, casting long shadows across the land. He didn't sleep much, but he wasn't afraid. If they came, they'd find a man ready not for battle, but for justice. Inside, Seraphine slowly began to emerge from her fear. She spoke more now, asking questions about the animals, about Eli's past, and about why he had chosen to protect her. She couldn't understand it. She wasn't royalty, hadn't offered him anything in return. Why risk so much for a girl he didn't know? Eli would often shrug and answer with quiet honesty. Because someone should. That answer stayed with her. She had grown up in a world where kindness came with a price and trust was earned only with power. Eli's simple belief that every person had value was something she had never experienced before, and it changed her. One afternoon, Seraphine came to Eli while he was repairing a broken fence. "What if they come for you? What if they hurt you because of me?" she asked, her voice trembling. Eli didn't stop working. He tightened the wire, hammered a nail, then turned to face her. "Then they'll come, but I won't let fear make my decisions." She blinked at him, stunned. "Aren't you angry at everyone turning on you?" Eli gave a tired smile. "A little, but I don't do right by counting who agrees with me. I do it because it's right." That simple truth was something the people of Pine Hollow had forgotten. Over the years, their fear of authority had eroded their courage. But Eli Stoburn weathered. Eli reminded them, even if quietly, what it meant to act with integrity. Still, the weight of it all pressed down on him. He missed the days when folks nodded at him in the street, when Clara the baker used to save him the last crust of rye, or when the local pastor stopped by for coffee. Now his name was whispered with suspicion, and children crossed the street to avoid his gaze. Yet he held his ground. A few townspeople, very few, watched from a distance with conflicted hearts. Some began to question what they were told. If Eli was wrong, why wasn't he running? Why wasn't he afraid? The answer lay in his stillness. There was a kind of strength in the way Eli refused to shout, refused to argue. He simply stood in quiet defiance, a pillar against the tide. His belief wasn't loud, but it was unshakable. Thought, and sometimes, that's what true courage looks like, not a sword in hand, but a steady heart when the world walks away. The whisper of change. By the end of the week, Eli's ranch was more isolated than ever. The trail leading up to it was empty. No visitors, no neighbors, and certainly no friends. Even the mail rider skipped his stop now, citing orders from above. But Eli remained, steadfast as the old oak by his barn, his boots worn and shoulders squared beneath the rising burden. Still, he never once thought about giving in. But what Eli didn't know was that the silence surrounding him was beginning to break, not loudly, not publicly, but in small, hesitant ways. It started with a loaf of bread. One morning, Eli opened his door and found it sitting on his porch, a warm, round loaf, wrapped in an old cloth. No note, no name, just bread. He stared at it for a long time, uncertain what it meant. A peace offering, a silent apology, or simply someone remembering that kindness didn't need to be loud. He brought it inside and placed it on the table beside Seraphine. Someone's starting to think, he muttered. She looked at him curiously. You think they're changing their minds? I think someone is, he replied. That's how change always starts. Quiet. Later that afternoon, while gathering firewood near the edge of his property, Eli noticed a figure on horseback, watching from the distance. Not a soldier, not a noble, just a villager. They didn't approach, but they didn't ride away either. The figure tipped their hat before turning back toward town. That night, a knock came at the door. Eli approached cautiously, rifle by his side, but when he opened it, he found a young man named Will, one of the blacksmith's apprentices, standing there, his hat clutched in his hands and his face red with shame. I brought some nails, he said awkwardly, holding out a small burlap sack. For your fence. Figured it might need fixing. Eli looked at him for a moment, then nodded. Thank you. Will didn't stay long, but his visit was a signal, a spark, and sometimes, that's all a fire needs. Over the next few days, more small signs appeared. A new blanket left on the fence. Post a jug of milk from someone's dairy cow. A simple message scrawled into the dust on his gate. Keep going. The village hadn't forgiven him yet, but they were starting to remember who he was. Not a rebel, not a fool. Just Eli Granger, the man who once pulled a drowning boy from the river, who repaired roofs after a storm without charging a coin, who had lived among them for decades in quiet, dependable strength. The turning point came the following Sunday. The villagers gathered for their weekly sermon in the small stone chapel at the center of Pine Hollow. Most of them still avoided speaking, of Eli especially, with the nobles still present. But then, Pastor Hewitt, a man known for his caution rather than courage, stood at the pulpit and cleared his throat. I was asked to speak about loyalty today, he began. About honoring those above us. But I find myself thinking not of kings, but of neighbors. Of a man who gave shelter to a frightened child, not for glory, not out of defiance, but because it was right. A ripple of unease moved through the pews. The pastor continued, his voice gaining strength. We've let fear steal our compassion. We've chosen comfort over courage. But when did we decide that following orders was nobler than protecting the innocent? Outside the chapel, the noble guards shifted uncomfortably, listening. I won't tell anyone what to believe, the pastor finished. But I will say this: when I look for examples of faith, of justice, I see them in actions, not titles. And I see them in Eli Granger. There was silence when he stepped down, but not the kind born of fear. This silence was thoughtful, heavy with awakening. By that evening, Eli noticed more faces watching his ranch, not with suspicion, but with something closer to admiration. He even spotted Clara, the baker, walking past slowly, her hands clenched at her sides, as though she was debating whether to wave. She didn't, but she looked him in the eyes, and that was something. Seraphine watched it all from the porch, seated beside Eli with a blanket draped over her shoulders. They're starting to see, aren't they? She said. Eli nodded slowly. Sometimes it takes time to remember what right looks like, and though the threat of the nobles still lingered, something in the air had shifted. The people were still afraid, but they were also starting to question, to wonder, to hope. And for Eli, that was enough for now. The threat returns just when the winds in Pine Hollow seemed to shift in Eli's favor. The noble camp took a darker turn. The royal envoy, having grown impatient with the village's inaction, sent a formal demand to the mayor. In it, they accused Pine Hollow of harboring a fugitive, obstructing royal authority, and encouraging civil disobedience. The words were veiled in formal language. But the message was clear. If Seraphine was not returned within 3 days, there would be consequences. Mayor Barrow, pale and sweating, brought the letter straight to Eli's ranch that evening. His hands trembled as he passed it to him. "I'm caught in the middle, Eli," he said miserably. "They say the entire town could lose trade privileges, even basic rights like security, mail, and medicine. And if they invoked the king's seal, they could label us a rogue settlement." Eli read the letter slowly, then folded it and handed it back. "They're bluffing." Barrow shook his head. "Maybe, maybe not, but they're nobles, Eli. They don't need to follow rules the same way we do. Please, if there's another way, find it." Eli said nothing, not because he didn't care but because deep down, he knew the mayor was right. The nobles didn't need an excuse. They could make life difficult for everyone, and no one would stop them. And yet, he looked back toward the cabin, where Seraphine was brushing the horses. A girl who had escaped a life of control, now starting to smile again. He wouldn't send her back. Not to those men. That night, Eli sat on the porch, staring into the darkness. His rifle rested across his lap once more. But this time, it wasn't just for comfort. He knew they might come, and if they did, it wouldn't be with parchment and polite requests. It would be with steel. Just before midnight, Seraphine crept out and joined him. "You think they'll come tonight? Maybe not tonight," he said. "But they'll come." "Then I should go," she said, eyes full of guilt. "This is my fault. You didn't ask for any of this. They're threatening your whole town. Because of me." Eli turned to her slowly, eyes steady. "You didn't ask to be hunted like an animal. You didn't ask to be treated like property, and I won't let you think your life is less valuable than our peace. But they might hurt you. They might," he said quietly. "But I won't live with myself if I let them take you back. Not now, not ever." She blinked, holding back tears. "Why? Why are you doing this?" Eli looked out over the field, where the moonlight danced across the tall grass. "Because the day we stop standing up for the innocent is the day we lose who we are." It wasn't long after that the warning came. Just before dawn, young Will, the blacksmith's apprentice, rode hard up the hill toward Eli's ranch. His face was streaked with sweat, and his voice cracked as he spoke. "They're coming," he gasped. "Half a dozen riders. Armed, headed straight for you." Eli stood up, calm but firm. "How long?" "Maybe an hour, less if they push." "Go back," Eli told him. "Tell no one else. I won't have folks getting caught in this." But Will didn't move. "You're not alone anymore, Eli. We've been watching. Some of us were ready to stand with you." Eli's expression softened. "Thank you, but this isn't your fight." "Yes, it is," Will replied. "You showed us that." With no more time to argue, Eli nodded. Will turned and galloped back toward town. Eli returned to the house, where Seraphine was already packing a small satchel. "I'm not running," she said before he could speak. "I didn't ask you to." Eli replied. They prepared in silence, both aware of what was coming. The distant sound of hooves echoed across the valley. Dust rose on the horizon. But this time, Eli didn't feel quite so alone, and far behind him, in the heart of Pine Hollow, lanterns were being lit in windows. Shadows moved in doorways. Word was spreading, and for the first time, it wasn't fear that traveled fastest, it was resolve. The enemy was coming. But so, too, were those who had once been silent, and Eli, he stood waiting, not with hate, with vengeance, but with the quiet strength of a man who knew that right and wrong didn't bend to fear. Not anymore. The riders arrived. The rising sun cast long shadows over the hills as 6 armored riders thundered down the trail toward Eli's ranch. Their crimson cloaks snapped like fire behind them, and dust clouds swirled in their wake. They bore the emblem of House Vardena sigil, feared across the region, and their swords gleamed with the authority of the crown. These were not messengers. They were enforcers. Eli stood in the middle of the field, calm as stone. He wore no armor, only his weathered coat and boots. But his rifle hung across his shoulder, and his eyes were steady, unblinking. Beside the barn, Seraphine watched from the shadows, her hands clenched tightly around the satchel she had packed the night before. As the riders slowed to a halt before him, their leader dismounted. He was tall, clean-shaven, and his polished breastplate reflected the morning light like a mirror. He removed his helmet, revealing a cold, noble face, one that showed no signs of empathy or doubt. "Elias Granger," the man said, voice clipped and formal. "By royal decree, you are hereby ordered to surrender the girl named Seraphine of Wintermoor, claimed property of Lord Aldric Vardane. You have obstructed royal business. This is your final warning." Eli said nothing for a moment. Then, slowly, he stepped forward. "She's not property," he said, his voice low but firm. "She's a person, and you're not taking her." The noble smirked. "You speak boldly for a man standing alone." "Am I?" The noble frowned. Well, just then, the wind shifted and with it came the sound of footsteps. Many footsteps dot from behind the trees, across the ridge, and along the dirt road. People began to emerge. Dozens of them. Men and women of Pine Hollow, farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, shepherds, and even the schoolteacher, all holding whatever tools or weapons they had managed to find. Some held pitchforks, others axes, and a few had old rifles from the days of the frontier wars. They formed a line behind Eli, silent but resolute. The noble's smirk faltered. "I told you," Eli said, his voice still calm. "You're not taking her." The noble turned to his men, uncertainty flickering across his face. He hadn't expected resistance, certainly not from simple townsfolk, not from people who, just days ago, had cowered and whispered in fear. "You would raise arms against the crown," he barked. "You realize what that means?" "No one's raising arms," Pastor Hewitt said, stepping forward with a Bible in hand. "But we are standing together." "You don't speak for the law," another rider snapped. "We speak for our town," Clara the baker called out. "And we've decided we don't hand children over to men like you." The noble was silent, his jaw clenched tight. The sheer number of people, over 100 now, was enough to give him pause. His orders had been clear: retrieve the girl, punish resistance. But this wasn't a single man being defiant. This was a community making a stand. He looked back at Eli, eyes narrowing. "This isn't over," he said through gritted teeth. "You've made a powerful enemy." Eli met his gaze without flinching. "So be it." The noble stepped back and mounted his horse. He signaled to his men, and reluctantly, they turned and began the ride back toward their camp. Not a single villager moved until they were out of sight. Only then did a breath seem to escape from the crowd. Eli turned to them, looking at each face. Many he knew, others only in passing. But today, they had all chosen to stand beside him. "You didn't have to do this," he said quietly. "We did," said Will, the blacksmith's apprentice. "Because you showed us what courage looks like." A murmur of agreement passed through the crowd. Seraphine stepped forward, staring in disbelief at the people who had once been too afraid to even look her in the eye. "You saved me," she whispered. Eli shook his head. "We saved each other. And though the battle might not be over, though the noble house might return with more force, more threats for now, Pine Hollow stood together. And Eli, once a lone rancher mocked for protecting a stranger, was no longer standing alone. He was standing with his town. Echoes of defiance, the dust from the noble riders had barely settled when the town realized the weight of what they had just done. Standing up to House Vardane was no small matter. It was an act of rebellion in the eyes of the crown, line crossed that could not be uncrossed. And yet, no one turned back. There was no panic, no fleeing, no regret, just a quiet, sobering awareness that everything had changed. That evening, Pine Hollow gathered in the town square. What began as a spontaneous meeting quickly became a council of voices: farmers, elders, the mayor, and townsfolk, all contributing thoughts, fears, and ideas. Eli stood near the back, leaning against the railing of the old feed shop, his hat pulled low over his brow, listening. He hadn't asked for any of this. But in the last few days, he had become a symbol whether he liked it or not. "We can't go back to the way things were," said Pastor Hewitt. "But maybe that's not such a bad thing. We need to be ready," added Clara the baker. "They'll come back. And next time, they won't just be 6 men. They'll send more. Maybe soldiers, maybe worse." A silence followed her words. The danger was real. But then Will, the young blacksmith's apprentice, spoke up. "We stood together once," he said. "We can do it again, and if they want to come for one of us, they'll have to face all of us." There was a murmur of agreement, a spark of resolve. Slowly, the townspeople began to organize. Plans were drawn how to fortify the entrance to the valley, who would keep watch at night, where supplies would be stored in case of a siege. For a town that had once been divided by fear and silence, it was astonishing how quickly unity replaced hesitation. Back at the ranch, Eli sat on the porch with Seraphine. The stars were just beginning to shine, and the night air carried a chill that reminded him of old winters and long rides. "I've never seen them like that," Seraphine said quietly. "All those people, they were brave." "They've always been brave," Eli replied. "They just needed a reason." She looked over at him, her eyes soft. "And you were that reason." Eli shook his head. "I was just the one who didn't back down first." A moment passed between them. Seraphine reached down and picked up the old loaf of bread someone had left days earlier. It had hardened, now inedible, but it reminded her of the moment everything had begun to change. "Do you think they'll come back soon?" she asked. "Sooner than we'd like," Eli admitted. "But we'll be ready." He wasn't sure what would come next. Whether the crown would escalate matters, or whether the stand they made today would echo across other villages, other towns. But one thing was clear: Pine Hollow was no longer afraid. The next morning brought an unexpected sight. A line of riders approached from the east, but they weren't soldiers of House Vardane. These riders bore different colors, and their armor was aged, not polished. At their head rode a grizzled knight, his banner tattered but still flying proudly. a silver hawk over a blue field. The town gathered once more as the riders entered. The knight dismounted and approached Eli directly. "We heard about what you did," he said without introduction. The story of a rancher who stood up for a girl the nobles called property, who inspired a village to defy injustice. Word travels fast in lands ready for change. Eli studied the man carefully. "And who are you?" "Sir Aldric of the Free Knights," the man said, bowing slightly. "We serve no king, only the people, and we've come to offer our allegiance." Behind him, over 100 knights raised their fists in silent salute. The town gasped. Eli stood motionless, processing what this meant. The defiance they thought might bring ruin had instead lit a beacon. Others had seen, others had heard, and they were answering the call. Seraphine stepped up beside Eli, her voice barely above a whisper. "You're not just a rancher anymore." Eli looked out at the gathered townsfolk, the approaching knights, and the hopeful faces of people once divided by fear. "Maybe not," he said, "but I'll never stop being one of them." A new legacy word of the stand at Pine Hollow continued to ripple through the surrounding lands like wildfire. What had started as one rancher refusing to bow to injustice had become a symbol, a turning point whispered across taverns, trading posts, and farmsteads. Villagers in nearby provinces began sharing their own stories of defiance, and others who had once felt alone now felt seen. Eli hadn't set out to spark a movement, but movements rarely begin with intention, with truth, and truth had stood its ground in Pine Hollow. The Free Knights stayed longer than anyone expected. They helped train the townspeople in defense tactics, repaired old watchtowers from the settlement's frontier days, and taught young blacksmiths how to forge stronger tools and basic armor. Pine Hollow, once a sleepy and overlooked dot on the map, began to transform into something more resilient, more prepared. Eli remained grounded throughout. He still rose with the sun, still tended to his horses, and still preferred silence to ceremony. But even he couldn't deny the shift in his life. Strangers rode into town just to meet him. Some came to shake his hand. Others came to ask advice. And a few simply wanted to look into the eyes of the man who had chosen right over safety. One afternoon, as Eli was repairing a section of broken fence, Seraphine approached him with a letter in her hand. Her hair was longer now, her smile more frequent, and her steps full of purpose. "You've been invited to speak," she said, a hint of amusement in her voice. "At the Council of Western Towns next month, they want you to talk about courage and unity." Eli raised an eyebrow, brushing dust from his gloves. "I'm not a speaker." "That's what makes you the right person," she said. "You didn't speak for attention, you acted when it mattered." He sighed, leaning against a post. "I just wanted to help one person, that's all." "And you did," she said, stepping closer. "But sometimes, helping one person helps the whole world. You showed them that fear doesn't have to win." They stood in silence for a moment, the wind rustling the tall grass. Eventually, Eli asked, "What will you do now?" Seraphine smiled. "I've been thinking of staying, maybe opening a school for girls, ones who didn't grow up with the freedom I've found here." Eli nodded slowly. "That'd be good. You'll come visit?" she asked. "I'll bring the fence posts myself." They both laughed, a quiet, easy laugh that came only from hard-won peace. As the sun began to set, the town bell rang out. Across Pine Hollow, not in mourning but in celebration. It had been 1 year since the day the 6 riders arrived. And now, every year on that date, the town would hold a festival not just to mark their defiance, but to remember the moment they discovered their strength. Children ran through the square with wooden swords and painted shields. The townsfolk danced, sang, and shared stories over open fires. Seraphine was there, surrounded by young girls asking about her journey. Pastor Hewitt recited a poem about courage. Even Mayor Barrow, once so timid, gave a rousing speech about justice and community. But the loudest cheer came when Eli stepped onto the platform. Hat in hand, he said little. Just a few words about standing together, about protecting the innocent, about choosing right even when it's hard. That was all he needed to say. The people already knew the rest. As night fell and lanterns lit the streets, Eli walked back to his ranch. He looked out at the horizon, where distant towns glowed under the same stars. He didn't know what challenges would come next, what battles others might face. But he knew this. One voice can break silence. One act of kindness can spark resistance. And one tired rancher, mocked for his compassion, can become the heartbeat of a new legacy. And though the road ahead would always carry struggle, fear, and doubt, Pine Hollow had found something greater: hope.